Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this Advanced Lightning Components session. My name is Christoph Conrads. I'm a developer evangelist with Salesforce. And before we get started, I wanted to know a little bit about you. How many people here have actually built Lightning components? Yay. OK, that's what I wanted to see. So we'll cover some advanced topics in this session. But before we start, I have to show you this slide, which makes me feel very uncomfortable as a developer, because that's not the kind of thing that I like to talk about. So I decided to try to find a workaround. And let's see if it works, OK? So I have here my home page. You see that I have that assistant. We'll see if we can add another assistant. So I'm going to go in App Builder here. Let's see what kind of component I have. Oh, look, there is a text-to-speech component there. OK, I'm going to put it here. We're going to go back, and then see, that's my little component here. And we're going to get some sound, hopefully. Otherwise, it's going to be really bad.
You should make your purchasing decisions based on currently available features and not forward-looking statements made in this presentation.
There you go. I don't have to do it myself. Great. All right, so I found a way. Thank you. But this is not just a little joke. This is actually totally relevant to this talk. Why? Because this is a Lightning component, and it's somewhat advanced. Because what did I use here to make this possible? I'm using some Chrome speech APIs. And unfortunately, there is that little thing that you may be familiar with that's called the locker service. Anybody heard of that thing? OK, and sometimes there are APIs that you can't use, and that was the case with that API. OK, so in that case, there is always a way. And the new way you have to actually use APIs that are not supported by a locker service is this here. It's called the Lightning Container Component. And that creates a safe sandbox that we let you use to actually load any API. So people often ask me, can I use Angular? Can I use React? Can I use library XYZ in my applications? Yes, you can. If it's Locker compliant, it just works as is. But if it's not, use the Lightning Container Component, and you're going to be able to use it no matter what, because in that case, you don't have access to the surrounding DOM, so there is no security concern there. But if it's in its little sandbox, you still want to be able to communicate with it. So here is how it works. So I have the UI. The UI is all in Lightning, but I use the Lightning Container Component here, and I point to a static resource where my unsupported code is, if you want. OK, so when I click the Say button, you see, I'm invoking Say button clicked in my controller. OK, so here is the trick. I create a message. Can you read that, or should I zoom a little bit? Maybe that doesn't hurt. OK, so I create an object with a phrase, right? And the phrase is whatever you typed in that text area. And then I find my JS app, which is really the Lightning Container Component, and I send it a message, right? So now let's go take a look at that app. So this is my JavaScript app. It could be React. It could be Angular. In this case, I'm just using that speech synthesis API that the Locker service would not let you use, right? But then I listen to a message that's passed to me by that container component. So now I get the message. Whatever you typed in that text area, I have it. Because I was listening to that message, I get it, and now I can say it for you. This is 8 lines of code, simple, but basically it answers all the questions. It should answer all the questions about, can I use library XYZ and how? Not only can you use it, but we have a protocol for you to communicate simply between the Lightning component and React, Angular, or whatever. In this case, I showed you Lightning to JavaScript library, but the same protocol works the other way. So if that JavaScript library has to communicate with the Lightning component, it works the exact same way. All right, so that was the Lightning container component, and we haven't even started. So what are we going to talk about in addition to that? We're going to talk about advanced techniques to do data access, data binding, and also write modular code. Okay, not trivial stuff, really more advanced techniques. So let's get started right away with data access. Oftentimes, people come to me and say, Christoph, you need to tell me sophisticated performance techniques so that I can save 10 milliseconds when rendering, my component because it looks really slow. And I'm happy to do that, but I always say, before you do any of that, look at data access, because data access is where most of the bottlenecks are. And people, forget to think about it, and they look for things that are really sophisticated, but let's focus on the basics first. So data access. So let me show you an example of that. Sorry, with this first component. So this is an application that I shared a few months ago. It's called Dream Invest. And it's basically a mutual fund explorer for people who are not at all in finance. This is just a bunch of investments that you can choose from, right? And I have many of them. And when I mouse over, I get useful information like what was the return, last year, over 2 years, 5 years, etc. So it's a cool little app, a good little sample application. But there are many funds. So look, I have 500 of them. I'm on page 1, so now I'm going to go on page 3 and things like that, okay? Now, I'm going to show you the code for this, and this should look really familiar, right? So let's zoom in just a little bit here. So this is the typical way you get to an Apex method. So this is actually the name of an Apex method, and then I pass some parameters, and finally I enqueue the action, meaning that I really call that Apex method, right? But just for fun, I'm tracing performance. So here I capture the start time, and when we come back here, I log the start time, I like the time now minus the start time. So it really gives me the time it took to execute that thing. So let's go back here, and I'm going to bring the console here. And what you see, because I did it already, so let's take a closer look. So every time I click page next, it took about 200 milliseconds. You see here 171, 176, 161. So every time I do page next, okay, it takes around 200 milliseconds. And of course, that really depends on your bandwidth. On the way here on my airplane, it was not at all 200 milliseconds. It was way more. So it's really important. And the thing is, now I'm on page 4, as you can see at the bottom here. But look, I'm going to go back to page 3, and it takes again 160 milliseconds. And that's kind of silly, because if you think about it, just 2 seconds ago, I had that page. And now, oops, all that waste going back to the server to get data that I had 2 seconds ago, right? So we need to really improve that, because now that's just one component, but imagine many components on the page accessing their data. You can easily create a bottleneck that way. Okay, we don't have a lot of time to debug this and try to improve performance, so how about we just add one line of code to fix all the problems, okay? Well, let's try that. Okay, so see here there is an action, right, where I point to the Apex method. So I'm just going to add one line of code. Action set storable. That's all, okay? That little line of code here. Okay, and what I'm saying here is when you get the result of this action with a specific set of parameters, store it. I want that action to be storable. Storable where? In a client cache. Okay? OK, great. So now I'm going to save this. We're going to go back here. I'm going to clear my little log here and refresh the page. OK, and you see that, of course, it still took 181 milliseconds to load the page the first time. When I go to page 2, I didn't have page 2, so it takes 172, 176. But the magic is here. I'm going to go back to the previous page now and look at this. 1 millisecond, not 200, 1. OK, because, of course, I had page 2, and now I'm going to go back to page 1. Well, below 1 millisecond. And this is, you know, every single query that you make. Like, for instance, in this application, I can look for mutual funds related to agriculture, for instance. OK? 352 milliseconds, because that's the first time I get that data set, right? Now I'm going to go back to the full data set, 0.79. And now I'm going back to agriculture, 0.6 milliseconds. Now this is huge, because again, this is just one component on the page. Imagine many, many, many components that can make a huge difference. Because you do that all the time, right? So even using these sliders here, OK, well, I'm just playing around. But why always go to the server when you ask for the same data again, again, and again? All right. So that is called storable actions. And there are two things you need to know about storable actions and how they really work. There are two values that you need to be aware of. The first one is called refresh age, and the second one is called expiration age. The refresh age is set to 30 seconds. In other words, if your data has been in the cache for less than 30 seconds, we will consider the data fresh, and if you ask for the same data, we will not go back to the server. Okay? If your data has been in the cache for over 900 seconds, 15 minutes, so the expiration age, we will say that's way too old. It's expired. We will not even consider that data, right? Expired. We go back to the server. And everything in between is the interesting part. We'll say, you know, let's say, for instance, the data has been in the cache for 45 seconds. Maybe it's still fresh. Maybe it has changed at the server side, right? So what we will do is we will send it to you right away, but just to be safe, in the background, we will get the data from the server again, and if it changed, we will notify your component again. So let's take 3 examples to kind of really clarify that. So in the first example, my component on the left is asking for data that I don't have in the cache, right? So I'm making a request, you know, the action, an enqueue action. And you know, you think as a developer that you're making a server call, but of course that call goes through the framework, and the framework tries to be smart. So it's going to say, OK, before I go to the server, I'm going to ask my client cache. And the client cache, in this case, is going to say, sorry, I don't have that piece of data available here. So at that point, we do what you expect. We go to the server. We get the response. We set it in the cache. And we set it in the cache. And then we send that response back to your component in the callback, right? So that's the first time you access data. Now, in my second example, the data is available in the cache and has been in the cache for less than the refresh age. What is the refresh age again? 30 seconds. So let's say it has been there for 20 seconds. So again, I make the same call. This can be another component, by the way. Okay? I make that request. The framework says, OK, before I go to the server, I'm trying to be smart. I ask the cache. Great. The cache says, I have the data, and it's fresh. I send it back to the component. No server round trip at all. And this is a huge win in terms of performance, obviously. OK? And so let's quickly look at a third example here. And that's the tricky one, right? So the data has been in the cache for over the refresh age, so more than 30 seconds, but less then 900 seconds. So it's in that middle area, okay? So same thing, I make my request, the framework asks the cache says, I have the data, but it may not be fresh. But because it's less than the expiration age, I will send it to the component. And the benefit is that the component gets a response right away. You get your data right away. But the framework says, I really want to be sure that the data is fresh. So behind the scenes, after I sent you the response, I make a request to the server for that data. I get the response. I set it back to the cache. And here, if and only if that new response, so number 6 if you want here, is different than the response that I sent you initially, so number 4. If 6 is different than 4, then I send you that new response. In other words, I call your callback method a second time. And so this can be a little surprising initially when you debug your code and you're like, oh my God, my callback is called twice. Well, that is the reason, okay? It's because we retrieve the data back from the server, and it's different from the response that we sent you initially. This has become a very common pattern, not only in Salesforce applications, but I always use the example of Facebook. When you open Facebook on your phone, boom, you get your feed right away, right? Because users want immediate data. But they do the exact same thing, and you may have noticed that maybe half a second later, poops, it kind of changes with the new items in your feed. That is the exact same pattern that we're using here. And hopefully, the response is the same, so there is no difference there. Now, there is an important thing to understand here. Some people like to work with JavaScript promises, right, which is a kind of a new way to make asynchronous calls. With storable actions, you cannot use promises. You really have to use JavaScript callbacks because, remember, the callback can be called twice, and a promise can only be resolved once. So if you use storable actions, you really have to stick to callbacks and not use promises. OK, so let's look at a second example related to data access. So my first rule here is really go to the server as the last resort, right? So that's a kind of a golden rule that you always have to keep in mind because it's super expensive. And storable action makes that super easy. The second rule that maybe is even more important in this new world of application composition. Application composition is fantastic, right? Now you can build apps by assembling components. And oftentimes, you will not even, you the developer, you will not even be the one creating that app. Maybe it's an admin in App Builder, right? You created all these amazing custom components, and an admin will grab them and assemble them. So my second golden rule is do not retrieve the same data in different components. Imagine you have 5 components on the page, and they all go to the server because they need the record data. That would be bad, right? So let me give you an example of that. And for this one, I will use another sample application called Dreamhouse. And I'm sure a number of you have seen Dreamhouse before. Dreamhouse, if you haven't seen it, is a sample application for the real estate business. And I have a list of properties. I chose one property for sale. Okay, it's a house for sale. And I have my default layout. This is actually a custom path. And then I created a bunch of custom components. That little widget here to show how many days that property has been on the market, locating on a map, and maybe showing some nice pictures of that property. Now, guess what? All these components need access to the record data. Right? So to be able to display how many days that property has been on the market, I need to have access to the record data. To be able to display the location of the property on a map, I need the record data. Now, the first time I built Dreamhouse, that was about 2 years ago, what I did was every single component had their Aura-enabled action to go get the record data from the server. Now think about this. How many components do I have on this page? I have 3 in the sidebar. I have a 4th here, the custom path. And then, of course, the default layout is also a component. I didn't write it, but it's the default and probably the header. So I think that's 6 components on this page. Imagine the disaster in terms of performance if these 6 components, all of them, make their own call to the server to actually retrieve the exact same data. That would be really, really bad. And think about it, because I still see a lot of applications built that way, and that would be really a massive bottleneck in terms of performance, right? So since then, we introduced the Lightning Data Service, which is actually GA in winter 18, okay? And so this is great because it solves the problem in a way that you don't even have to worry about. It's going to be solved for you automatically. So let's take a look at the path, for instance, that custom path. Okay, I want you to look at that component for a second here. So let's pay attention to the component tag. Do you notice something special about the component that actually needs to access data, right, to access the property record? You notice that there is no controller here, right? So there is no Apex controller involved. None. Instead, we use force record data. And so basically, we're saying, hey, I need the data for that record, and specifically, I need the ID field and the status of the property, because that's what the path component shows, right? Is it available? Is it under agreement? That kind of stuff, right? So now so that was the path. Let me show you property days on the market. That's little widget that shows how many days the property has been on the market, all right? Again, same thing, no controller, force record data, and a bunch of fields. All right? And you notice that there is an event handler that you can hook up here that's called record updated. So when record updated, I want to call that method in my controller, and this is when I re-render the chart. And the benefit of that is that not only, so this is a cache essentially, all these components share the same record in memory. That's what the Lightning Data Service does. So when you ask for that record data, it doesn't go to the server. It says, hey, I have it in memory. Here you go. And a side effect and benefit of that is that all these components are in sync. How many times do you see components supposedly showing the same data, but for some reason they are not in sync? So if you change the data in one component, the other component still shows the old data, and that's super confusing for the user, right? So here, imagine, for instance, that maybe I made a mistake entering the date when that property was listed, okay? Let me actually go down. So you keep an eye on the widget showing how many days the property has been on the market. Okay, I'm going to tab out and save it. And automatically, that component re-renders. And I really didn't have to do anything. So the side effect, or look here, if I change the status of that property, I go under agreement. Keep an eye here, because I display the status in the default layout there. Boom, under agreement, automatically under agreement was kept in sync. You don't have to do anything. It just happens, okay? So let me quickly review with you how the Lightning Data Service works. So you have different components on the page here. The first one is going to say, hey, I need record 111, and these are the fields that I need, name and status. At that point, the Lightning Data Service doesn't have that record in its cache, so it's going to go to the server and bring back exactly what you wanted. The second component is going to say, I need the same thing. I also need name and status. At that point, the Lightning Data Service is going to say, great, I have that thing in my cache. There you go. No round trip involved. Now, component C is going to say, I also need record 11111, but I need slightly different fields. I need the name and the location. Maybe that's the map. So the Lightning Data Service is going to say, well, I have that record, but I'm missing the location. So I'm going to go back to the server just to fetch that additional property, which is the location. So this thing is super smart, but from an API point of view, from a developer point of view, it's super simple. Okay, you don't have to worry about loading records in cache, keeping data in sync. It happens automatically. So that was data access. So let's focus now on data binding. Now, data binding, you may wonder, why is this in this session? This session is super advanced, and well, it's advanced. I didn't call it super advanced. It's advanced, and you have seen things like that, right? That is data binding. Curly braces, exclamation mark, that's how you bind UI components to a model, to attributes, right? Seems very simple. That is basic. Now, you notice that in my little example, this happens in an iteration. So maybe I have multiple contacts. And so I do that for each contact. I bind the first name to that input field. From an API point of view, a developer point of view, this is great. Now, the thing that you may not realize is that every time you use that syntax, curly brace, exclamation mark, you know what we have to do in the framework? For every single bond expression, we call that bond expression, which is another word for saying two-way data binding, okay? We need to set up 2 event listeners for each bond expression. The first event listener is, hey, if the model, so if the attribute changes, we need to know that so that we can update the UI element. Okay, so that's the first listener. And the second listener is, hey, if the user changes the value in the UI element, we need to set up a change listener on that so that we can update the model accordingly. So that's two-way data binding, right? That's bidirectional data binding. This is expensive. You don't realize it's not expensive to type curly brace exclamation mark, but what happens behind the scenes is very expensive, especially if, like in my example, you do that in a loop with many bond expressions multiple times, right? Which is why in a recent version of Salesforce, we introduced unbound expression. So the syntax is almost the same. It's curly hashtag. And this is called unbound expression. So how does this work? When the component is created, in this case the input field, when it's created, we set the value. Whatever the value of contact's first name is, boom, we set it in that input field. And that's it. It's unbound. We don't listen to anything. If the value of contact changes later on, too bad. We will still have contact.firstname. All right? A major misconception here, and I'm pretty sure it may have made it in the doc even, is that this is one-way data binding. It's not. It is actually one-time data binding. Okay? We set it and we forget about it. There is no more connection between contact, the attribute, and that input field. But this is a huge resource saver. And so for the right use cases, it can make a fantastic difference. So let's take a look at an example. I'm going to look at that property explorer here. OK, so I have a list of houses for sale. And look, when I select one, I get details on the right here. Fantastic. OK, so let's try to improve performance here. So I'm going to go to my code. And I have that. Move a little bit here. I have that property tile list. And you see here that I have that iteration, okay? And then inside that iteration, I have a property tile. So I'll create a property tile for each property in the list. And right now, I'm using that expensive stuff, right? So I'm going to do that and save. Okay, I'm going to make it unbound. But look, for each property, I'm creating a tile. So let's look at tile now. So this is tile. And again, it's full of bound expressions that I will quickly replace by unbound expressions, at least a few of them in the interest of time here. And I save that. OK, so it's saved. I can go back, and we'll see if it still works as expected. It does. I still have my tiles, and I'm still displaying in the tile all the information that I wanted. I just saved a bunch of resources. Okay? Let's try to take it even further. So now, let's focus on this interaction, right? I select a house, and on the right, like for instance in that summary property, in that summary component, I display the details. All right, so let's take a look at property summary. And here's what I will do. For address, okay, I'm going to try to save some more resource. I'll do it just for address and city in the interest of time. Boom. I'm going to save this. Okay. Who thinks it's going to work? It's going to work. Who thinks it's not going to work? A lot of people are undecided. That's okay. All right. Okay, so here's the moment of truth. I'm going to click. Oh, it doesn't work. You see, the address is gone. I still see the comma, though. That's cool. All right. Why is it gone? Because look, so let me refresh the page to really understand what's happening here. At this point, at this very moment, that component has been created. The property summary has been created. Now, what was the value of property in property summary at this point? Undefined, because I didn't select one on the left, so it doesn't know which property to display, so the value of the property attribute is undefined. But it was set one time. It was set to undefined. That's a proper, totally fine value, undefined. So meaning that when the value of property changes later on, that thing doesn't care anymore because it's totally unbound and it doesn't change its value. Okay, so again, unbound expressions don't always work depending on your use case. If you want to keep things in sync, then you need a bound expression. But inside an iteration, it's perfect to use unbound expression because by definition, if you create a component inside the iteration, you have the data. It's not undefined, you have the data. Okay, so third golden rule for today, use unbound expressions whenever you can, because that's going to save a lot of resources. It's also going to make your applications faster because all these listeners, you know, they consume resources. Okay, so let's move on to the next chapter, and this is about writing modular code. Oftentimes, people ask me, I have multiple JavaScript components, and I have code, logic that I want to reuse across these different components. How do I do that? It doesn't seem obvious to do that. Now, the latest versions of JavaScript, ECMAScript 6, ECMAScript 7, they have that new concept of JavaScript modules, right? Unfortunately, many browsers, or some browsers at least today, still do not support JavaScript modules. So in Lightning Components, at this point, we do not support JavaScript modules because the browsers that you're using may not support it. But there are other ways you can do that. So let me show you an example. I'll show you yet another little sample application that I shared a few months ago. This is a dashboard. I was, I guess, in the Olympic spirit. All right, so I have different countries here, and I want to see in the different Olympics how many, you know, like the distribution of medals by country and stuff like that, right? How would you build a dashboard, like really an interactive dashboard like this in a Lightning component? Well, you could rebuild everything from scratch, but people typically will say, well, there are charting libraries out there, right? And one that is very popular is called Chart.js. Does anybody know how you actually import a third-party library like Chart.js inside a Lightning component? What do you do to use that? There is a tag that lets you import a third-party library. Lightning require, very good, LTNG require. And in fact, let me show you the example here of that specific piece of code, LTNG require, and then I have my static resource, which is chart.js version 2.3, and that's it. And now I can use that JavaScript library. If you can do it for third-party library that someone else wrote, why wouldn't you be able to do it for a library that you wrote, right? And use LTNG require to import your own library. So let me show you an example of that. So the simplest way to actually create a JavaScript static resource is to, from the developer console here, open static or new static resource. In this case, I wrote it for you. I have a super complex counter component here that I wrote as a static resource. So it attaches itself to the window object. It has a value. We start at 0. And then it has two methods, increment, which is going to increment that value by 1, and get value, which is going to return the value. Pretty simple, right? And so now I'm going to look at a Lightning component that actually uses that counter component. So you see my LTNG require here with counter. So I'm importing that static library. And then I have two buttons, get value and increment. Now let's see what I do when we click these buttons. Okay, so when I click get value, remember that counter attached itself to the window object. Now I can invoke its get value function, and same thing for increment. So let's see this in action. So I'm going to go here in demos, and I'm going to edit this page. Okay, and I'm going to add counter, and just for fun, I'm going to add two of them. You'll see why in a second. Okay? And so I'm going to do this, and I'm going to start incrementing. Okay? So this works fine. Now, the thing that you need to be aware of is that right now they actually share that value. So if I do increment here, look, it keeps going, and now so they are sharing that value, which depending on the use case, this can be wonderful. Because with that, you could implement an entirely custom cache, for example. Okay? But in some other use cases, you may want something different. So for that, I would have here, I can show you another static resource, another version of it, counter2, where, in fact, I define counter as a constructor. So when I need to use it, I do a new counter. And in that case, they all have their own value. So that depends on the use case, what you want to do. Now, that's a first way you can build modular code. And it's really good for general purpose type of code, right? There is another approach to reuse code, especially when it's about data access logic. And that is to create what we call a service component. So let me quickly show you an example of a component that is a service to access an account. Okay, and so here we go. This component is really interesting. It has an Apex controller defined here. And one thing that you notice is that it has strictly no UI. You see, there is no UI here. Okay? However, it defines an Aura method called findAll. And that's if you want the public API of that service component. Okay, so that other components will be able to call findAll. Okay, and what do I do when findAll is called? Business as usual. I do my, I access my Apex method and I enqueue the action. So now let's quickly see how you could actually use that service component in another component here called account list. Okay, so here's a component. Now, this is account list. It's going to display a list of accounts. Notice, however, in the component tag that it has absolutely no controller, right? However, what I'm doing here, I embed my account data service, right? And on init, because I want to display the list of accounts right away, on init, what do? I call the findAll method of my service component. Okay, so we have a minute here to see it in action. So I'm going to go back to my demo page, and I'm going to drop account list on that page. And you see that even in App Builder, you see the data, OK? So I'm going to save this and go back. And here is my list of accounts. So let's quickly go back here, because this is a super interesting pattern. Oftentimes, people ask me, Christophe, can a Lightning component have multiple Apex controllers? And the answer to that question is no. A Lightning component can have only one controller. In other words, you can only have one of the, if you really type controller here, you can only specify one. However, with this pattern, we actually have 0, right? But the same way I embed here account service, I can embed contact service, order service, opportunity service, as many as you want. Okay? And so this is a really interesting way to reuse logic and also to allow you to have multiple objects inside the same component. So let's go back to the slide to summarize. So we saw JavaScript library. We used a service component. So to summarize this session, cache, 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 right? And we make it easy for you with storable actions and with the Lightning Data Service. Use unbound expressions when possible and write modular code 2 ways using JavaScript libraries and a service component. And that's all the time we have. Thank you very much. Thank you.